Next is our last session for the day, a pea and a lentil market outlook from Chuck Penner, president at LeftField Commodity Research. Chuck grew up on a family farm in Manitoba, Red River Valley, and has 30 years of experience in the Canadian grain business. Welcome, Chuck.
Thank you, Trent. That's yeah, I'm good to go. It is so good to be somewhere. It's like just, and I shouldn't say it this way, but my wife and I drove up yesterday, which is a good thing because apparently at Whitewood, the highway was closed, the Trans-Canada was closed this morning. Anyway, the extent of our travels this winter is the Holiday Inn Express in Regina. So not saying anything about that, but it's just good to be somewhere. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to come here and see a few familiar faces. And so we're gonna get into it a little bit, and I can take questions during, or well, I guess with the mic, it's better to do it after. And if you have questions, again, I'm just so glad to be somewhere. If you want to talk about other crops, I'll be glad to talk about those too. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, because otherwise I'd be in my office and staring out the window and whatever. So we're going to talk about what's happening this year for peas and lentils. The presentation is specifically about peas and lentils, but my partner John and I, we cover 16 different crops. So like I said, at the end, if you want to do a free-for-all, please, or if I don't cover something adequately in the presentation, we'll do that. So we'll look at a little bit about how we got to where we are right now, and then the outlook for the next year, and then maybe even if we get a chance to talk about some of the longer term effects, but we're going to be talking peas and lentils today. So I'm not sure if you recall, because we kind of be forgetful, but last year we had a drought. My first year of farming was 1988 in the Red River Valley, and my wheat went 2 bushels an acre. So I kind of know, I feel the pain. I mean, at that time I was just a young university student trying to make my way, but it still was. I still remember that year pretty whatever. But what we have is a number of different effects. So it's causing effects. It's caused ripple effects that move forward into this year and maybe even into next year as well too. Likely into next year as well too. So almost every crop is in short supply. If I'm trying to think of one in Western Canada that isn't, I don't know, maybe rye. Like that's about it. Everything else is short right now. There's just not enough out there. So we have old crop bids that hit record levels. If you think about flax, for example, $45 flax. What was the old high? The old record high? Anybody guess? 16, 17 bucks. So almost triple the old high. Like that's the kind of year it was. And even the new crop bids now, $12 yellow peas, $40 large green lentil, or 40-cent large green lentils. Sorry, someone got excited there in the back. 40-cent large green lentil bids and things like that. Those are either at record levels or we haven't seen them in a lot of years. So that's still the carry forward from last year's drought. Then there's a whole bunch of other variables that are going on that are also affecting decision making. So seed costs. When even if you're using common seed, those kind of prices, and I'm not advocating that, trust me, I'm not advocating that. But even common seed are at these sky high price levels, right? And you can either, even if you have it in your bin, you could have sold it somewhere else, or so the opportunity cost is that high. Seed supplies, clearly that's an issue. Fertilizer costs, I don't think that's necessarily a drought-related thing, but it is a significant issue. Disease things are always a big deal. A drought tolerance, how did crops do? I'm hearing people say, geez, I'm not growing barley this year because it did so lousy last year. Those kind of comments, right? Herbicide resistance, herbicide carryover is one that I'm hearing about more that I hadn't really, and I really don't know much about these things, but I'm hearing about them anyway. Product availability, again, probably not a drought issue, but other things. We've also had trade patterns and market share shifting. So when Canada and the northern US, Montana, North Dakota, had just these awful crops this last year, suddenly there were trade things happening that have never happened before. So bringing in, this was even before the drought because canola supplies were already, but a year ago, we were already bringing in Ukrainian rapeseed into Eastern Canada for crushers there. This year, we're bringing Danish barley into Eastern Canada for maltsters. We're bringing in mustard from Russia. Those are the kind of things, again, never seen those kind of things happen before, and yet we have these wild kind of market moves. And so one of the things that I think about is how many of those kind of things, those established patterns, or those things that happened this year are going to become established patterns. Some of them will, some of them won't, because you need extreme prices to make some of those trades work. But it's been remarkable. I mean, most of our flax, for example, all went to the States. Most all went to the States. Dumb sentence. A whole pile of our flax went to the States, almost, or very, very little to China, very little to Europe. And it used to be split about 3 ways. So all of these kind of things. And so once those patterns happen this year, is that going to change going forward next year? And there are some reasons to think that some of them will. There's our buyers' behavior. So the importers overseas, they're buying hand to mouth. Like they're really, really, really reluctant to buy anything more than they absolutely need, because they're all just crossing their fingers and hoping for better crops next year and lower prices. So they're really, really trying to do that. And then something that I say here, it's this bid-ask spread. So what that means is what these importers are willing to pay for your lentils and for your peas and so on, and what you as farmers are willing to sell them for. There's a bit of a difference, especially the guys who are still holding on right now. There's a bit of a difference between what those buyers are willing to pay and where you're willing to sell it for. So how does that get resolved? Who comes toward who? Who's got the stronger hands? Who's more stubborn? Who's more, whatever word you want to use? That's the kind of situation that's going on right now with how buyers are looking at things. So again, these are all impacts from the drought that we had last year. And then there's a few more, reluctance to forward contract. And who can blame you? Even though these prices are great, and it was white all the way here, driving all the way from Winnipeg to here, it was white. But there's some areas where it's not. And even then, it's pretty thin on the ground. And those memories of last year, I don't blame anyone for being reluctant to forward contract, but that's changing a whole set of behaviors as well too. And in terms of how buyers, how importers or processors, how they're being forced to bid. Changes to cost of production, of course, that's a huge one. There's all kinds of changes to that this year. And so I'm not going to really get into all of that. Higher price expectations. So farmers' price expectations have gone up, unquestionably. And I say it's self-fulfilling. I use that word self-fulfilling because this is 1 year, like you've heard the expression before, well, farmers are just price takers. Well, this year, not the case, because the market has been so short of product that you have been able to support prices just by your reluctance to sell. I mean, you think about the mustard market, and right now $2 a pound price bids for brown mustard. That's because farmers who still have it, and there are a few, have been holding it off the market, and they've been able to do that. And it's been happening with other crops. And it's not to say that you control the price exactly, and I understand that, but you have had far more power in price setting this year than you have in other years. There's weather worries earlier than usual. I mean, I don't know. I've been doing this for a few years now, and I don't ever remember people asking me, so where is crop insurance going to set their prices? This year, that question came out numerous times. I heard from numerous people because that's the expectation. Geez, what if we don't get another crop this year? What's my bottom line going to be? Or where am I going to be that way? And then, of course, the spike in fertilizer prices. Oh, and then this Black Sea conflict thing. And so we'll talk about that. I'll talk about that a little bit with respect to peas. It's not really an issue for lentils, not much. I will touch on it there as well too. but I can talk about it. It's very different based on which crop you're talking about. So talk about that. But that uncertainty has caused markets to go ballistic and then barf and then back up again. And, you know, so if it wasn't a volatile enough year before, you know, that just makes it even more so. So there are still some drought concerns. This map on the left here, I'm sorry, it's as big as I could blow it up. This map on the left is the drought monitor as of the end of February. So if you dialed back a year, you wouldn't see all of this red and even the dark brown. This year, it's already much, or it's still much more serious. This was January, this map. So it has gotten better with the snow that's fallen even during the months of January, or sorry, the months of February. And then get a little bit more, and I'm hearing, I think, you know, PA was supposed to get more snow tonight or something like that. And so it's kind of being whittled away, but there are still serious areas where drought is still a concern. So again, who's going to be forward contracting if you're in one of those, and there aren't many areas without some kind of color, frankly. So it's still a serious concern. This, sorry, this is even worse. So here's the prairie provinces, and this is snow cover. So Davidson, at least this was as of early March. So Davidson, it said it's 16 inches. Driving up, I don't think so. Or maybe it was some of it's melted, I don't know. But there's huge variability. So you go further north, and so this, sorry, this isn't inches, this is centimeters. So you go up to PA and you've got 40, 60 centimeters of snow up at PA. You know, I'm from Winnipeg, and I don't think it's ever going to melt. You know, we may just skate right through till next winter. But then you get down into these areas of southwestern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, then you go across the line into Montana, North Dakota, western North Dakota. I talked to a guy from Montana, and he says, nope, nothing, still nothing. Nope, nothing yet. Nope, still nothing. And so that's what they're facing as well too. And the reason that's important is because Montana, western North Dakota are typically the areas where they're growing lentils, where they're growing chickpeas, where they're growing, you know, peas are, you know, a little bit broader area, but those are some of the areas too. So knowing what happens there is very important. So now jumping into peas, we had a bit of an issue last year. So production was down almost half for yellows, well over half for greens, and then almost 70% for the others. Although, you know, measuring the maples and the, you know, those kind gets pretty dicey. But that's the kind of a situation that we had just in terms of production. In terms of total supplies, we lost 2.1 million tons of peas this last year. And because Canada is such a major exporter, that's what caused prices to go ballistic. Now, that didn't happen across the board. Largely, the $17, $18 yellow pea bids that we saw were coming from American buyers. Now we're starting to see them actually strengthen a little bit again, and we're starting to see China come back into the market a little bit. So we'll talk about that a little bit more yet. But when you take that much out of the supply situation, and again, and then that's what drives those kind of prices when you dominate a market like that. So here's our exports for the year. So this is China. Red lines are obviously China. So sorry, cheap joke. So the red bars are China. So you can see what's happened there. The light blue is India. So India is a non-issue for peas. So Jared, don't ask about China or India and peas. Just don't ask. Okay, thank you. So India is a non-issue. So China really dropped a whole lot. This purple are other Asian countries, some of the more price-sensitive buyers. So they've really dropped off. The one that didn't is the US, and that's this dark blue. So they actually increased their imports this year. So everybody else was cutting back, cutting back, cutting back. It was the US. And so most of that is for this processing business that we were hearing about earlier. And so if you want to know whether processing into all of these various things is a good thing, yes, absolutely it is. And I could point the oat market to you. I could say the same thing about oats, same thing about canola, where we have significant domestic processing. I could point to that same type of situation, that they were your strongest bidders this year. They were the least likely to back off when prices went high. So that's what was happening. So the US actually became our second largest buyer after China. And so that's been very, very positive. This is the USP trade. So the dark blue bars at the top are their exports, and then the red, the bottom part, are their imports. So you can see that just since harvest, they've really started to increase their imports again. And in November, it was a record month for them. They imported 60,000 tons from Canada, but here's one of these trade flows: 20,000 tons from Ukraine. So bringing 20,000 tons of peas all the way from Ukraine, just because they were priced cheaper, even with the freight, than Canadian peas were. So that's backed off a little bit. In January, they imported very few again, and so I think they'll be back in again. I think that maybe is a bit of a 1 month blip, but the U.S. will continue, or has been, a strong buyer. And if they don't have another crop again in 2022, it's dry down there again, they will continue to be a big buyer in this next year. These are some other countries. Sorry, I was sitting at the back there and I had to go get my glasses at one point, so I apologize for the. But these are various exporters, or some of the main exporters anyway. This purple bar is Russia. This light blue bar is Ukraine. This is the US as well too. And who else do we have? France, Australia, Argentina, all smaller exporters. But the Black Sea origin really responded when Canadian peas were not available. So again, these trade flows really started shifting. So far, Ukraine and Russia cannot export into China. So China is our dominant buyer. They buy, what's it now? Like 70, 80% of our peas. So far, Ukraine and Russia haven't been able to export into China because of phytosanitary barriers. The issue is China is getting tired of paying $17, $18 for yellow peas. So they are in talks, they have been in talks anyway with Russia, might be on the back burner for now, but they've been in talks with Russia to lower those barriers, and so they could start importing Russian peas. That's going to be an issue going forward, and not a good one for us, is if we have to compete with Russian peas getting railed into China. That's a concern. So here are their exports this year, is this black line with the yellow dots. So they're on track with their record year that they had in 17-18. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen in the next few months. If they were going to stay on that pace, there would still be another 750, 800,000 tons that they would need to export this year. And I think the Russians had a big enough crop to do that. But of course, now with Black Sea shipping basically, at a standstill, Black Sea ports being blocked off, I don't know where that's going to happen. And so that's I think one of the reasons why we're starting to see our pea bids come up again a little bit just in the last few weeks, frankly, because I don't think they can maintain, or they won't be able to maintain this pace if their ports are shut off. A good chunk, most of Ukrainian and Russian peas go into Western Europe for feed, essentially. So again, if the EU, I don't know if I haven't heard that they're blockading peas. It's not making CNN or Fox News headlines. I don't know if they're blockading peas, but if that business is cut off, again, those peas will have to, will just be sitting there essentially and waiting for next year. Here's Chinese pea imports. So this black line with the yellow dots, that's the current year. That's the current year's pace since June. So they started off just been mediocre and have stayed that way. And in December, we don't have their January data yet. December really dropped off. So it kind of flattened out like that. Last year, they imported over 3 million tons of peas. Canada accounted for about 2.5 million tons of that. So what happened that year, though, is They're running at roughly half of last year's pace. And the reason is because the Chinese market is made up of feed demand and fractionation demand, mainly. Those are the two big users. And so our pea prices got high enough that the feeders just said, no, we're out. We'll buy soy meal or we'll feed something else to our livestock. So that feed demand just disappeared. And so that accounts for, and you get various estimates depending who you talk to, at least 1.5 million tons of demand. So 1.5 million tons of demand just because it was priced out of the market. And so their fractionation demand that they're splitting into starch and protein, that's the demand that's left. And so it depends on how big you think that part of the market is. I've heard estimates as low as 800,000 tons. My own, I think it's 1.2 million or even a little bit north of that. But that's the base demand that they're going to buy. I don't know if regardless of, but that's the base demand. If you go back, if you want a bit of a history lesson though, in terms of our entrance into China as a market, it was because their other sources, they were fractioning or they were milling for starch, not protein, but they were milling for starch. And they were using mainly mung beans. Mung beans got too expensive. So they started to look for other sources of starch. Peas became the cheaper alternative to mung beans. And so a whole industry shifted over in that direction. But the question is now is if yellow peas going forward, or if they see that they're going to be, I don't know, 12, 14, 16 dollars a bushel, equate back to here at that, are they going to look for other sources of cheap starch? I don't know what else is out there. I've heard they've used potato starch at times, things like that. The protein part of the market has really come up too. So it's not just the starch issue anymore. So that may be not as relevant. North American domestic use, we've talked about this processing capacity and things like that. And just keep in mind when you look at this chart, it also includes feed use. And feed use this year, my expectation is that it's down quite significantly. Again, because it's priced itself out of that market, even domestically. And we didn't have a poor quality harvest essentially for that sometimes pushes a whole bunch of pulses into the feed market. But it's still growing. And so I don't think in terms of our processors, I don't think this year was one where they were operating at full capacity for the full year. So I think that's going to be happening in this next year. And then as we see other little bits of capacity, and I mean, I don't know what's up with you guys here in Saskatchewan. All you can do is get these canola crush plants going. Come on, you guys. You got to do something with pulses. Come on, Jared, get on that. Sorry. My brother is on the board of the Manitoba Pulse Growers. And he says, I don't know how many times I've been asked the question, why did Roquette build in Portage? Like he's been asked that question like a bazillion times and doesn't really have a great answer anyway. Anyway, sorry, in terms of the ending stocks at the end of this year, so very, very low ending stocks, and yellows will probably actually be lower than greens. So that's why you have this abnormal kind of a discount for green peas right now versus yellows, is because last year we carried forward some pretty big supplies of greens into the year that we're in now. So that's kind of offset that. So that's still hanging over the market and keeping green peas down to some degree. Here's yellow pea prices at a whole bunch of different origins or locations, global markets. This blue line is China. So this is the one to watch. So prices in China have been heading higher. And this is not what our importers are getting. This is what their traders are selling to processors at, essentially. So that's this blue line here. So that's, again, one of the reasons why they're running low. They bought a schwack of peas at the beginning of the year. And then now it wasn't enough to carry them through for the whole year. So now they're starting to come back, and they may only need to buy another 300,000-400,000 tons. So it's not unlimited demand, but it's they don't have a whole lot of options. The other, where's Saskatoon? So that's this red line here. So we started at, we hit our highs early in the year and have been kind of drifting lower. And I think now, if I put in this week's prices, you'd see a small uptick there. So I've seen some, yeah, I think this morning I saw an $18 bid. Don't ask me who, because I can't remember, but I saw an $18 bid again for yellow peas. So we're starting to move that higher. I don't know how long that can go on, how big that demand is. Like I said, I think Chinese demand is another 300,000 to 400,000 tons, maybe a little more domestically. So it's not going to be forever, but it's an opportunity for those guys who couldn't pull the trigger the first time. Maybe they'll have the opportunity again. But even then, some of these other markets, like this green line, is France. Prices starting to go a little bit higher there. Even prices in the U.S. in North Dakota, that's the pink line there. Australian prices moving higher. Australia has been cheap like dirt on every crop this year. So all of these markets are starting to move. So I think there's another opportunity yet this year to do some yellow pea pricing. This is our bulk pea exports, our pace this year, this blue line here. And so it's been just been flatlining for a long time now. That's almost all been since this movement. This is the early Chinese movement here. And now we're starting to see again some movement. So again, maybe 300,000 to 400,000 tons. And so we might get up to this level, but essentially that's about as much as we have available to send in, or to ship out anyway. This doesn't include containers, by the way. So that's another, you heard about that story already. In terms of the seasonal price index, typically both yellow and green pea prices start to drop lower in May, because then you got a crop in the ground and it's starting to look green, at least most years. And so that's when the prices start to tip over. This year has been really challenging for people like me. Sorry, back up. People often ask you to predict what's going to happen in the future. I can't tell you that. I can give you some signs. We do some reconnaissance. We try and see some of the things that are developing, but I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen in the future. Those people who tried to predict the future this year were severely humbled on all kinds of fronts, right? So that's been one of the challenges. Is I like to look at things like seasonals. I like to, like those types of things, patterns from previous years. Well, some of those you just kind of tossed out the window this year because. But I'm starting to wonder, whether we're seeing some of this seasonal influence re-exert itself on the market. So are we going to see prices again? Because in January they're at a bit of a lower point, and then they work their way higher. So I think there's some of that happening in the gains we've seen in yellow and in green pea bids. They've both been kind of coming up a little bit. Whether some of that is just simply a seasonal influence. And so again, trying to predict when that's over, I think probably the same timeline is when the market is going to turn lower again this year. Because again, end use buyers, importers, all buying hand to mouth. And if they can have enough to just squeeze them through until the next harvest, then that's going to be a bit of an issue. The whole Ukraine, Russia issue, which I'll talk about in a second, does kind of throw a little uncertainty into those kind of plans, though. So we'll talk about that. So this year, domestic processing was up a little bit, more aggressive demand from the US. The feed demand from China just evaporated, and some other price-sensitive buyers, especially in South Asia, disappeared. More peas were exported by Russia and Ukraine. They had a very strong pace. And those price declines that we had in the last little while, I think were one of the things that kind of kicked the Chinese buying back into gear. And that's simply what needs to happen. In terms of this next year, our guesstimate, and frankly, they're just guesstimates. Like, again, I don't predict the future, I guesstimate. So what my guesstimate is that we're going to see a small increase in pea acres, very small. And it'll all happen in yellow peas. Green pea acres are going to drop off just because of that discount. So they're going to drop off quite significantly. And so that's kind of where we're looking at it. And part of it is related to nitrogen costs and all kinds of things. And part of it is simply regular crop rotations. Guys want to stick to them and that type of thing. Our yield estimate, we have a bit of a cautious yield estimate because when we look back at when we've had severe droughts in the past, like 88, 2001, 2002, it's taken a couple of years for yields to get back to normal. It doesn't bounce back in 1 year. And so based on that, we'd love to see yields come back in a big way. But generally, they don't tend to do that. So we're at a little bit of a cautious yield estimate. It's basically 5%. No, it's the 5-year average. I just did this week, I should remember. But it's 5% below the average, something like that. Wow. So what does that mean for supplies this next year or this upcoming year? Well, it means that we'd see a good recovery from the year that we're in, but not back up to where we were the 5 years before that. So unless we get a fantastic spring and summer and we get yields back up to those levels, we're not going to see that Canada is producing enough peas to fill all of that demand again. That tends to support prices. And it would be even less for greens. Yellows won't get back, are recovering a fair amount, but green pea supplies are going to basically stay where they are. That's my guesstimate at this point. And so what that means is it's supportive for prices, but not at the levels when we had these kind of supplies. So I don't think, again, who knows what the weather is going to do? Well, Drew Lerner does, but nobody else does. And so, this is the kind of scenario that I would say are our best odds anyway. So we're going to see yields come back to some degree. We're going to see supplies come back to some degree. So we're not going to be, cross your fingers, dealing with a drought again like that, and have those really, really low supplies. So prices not where they are right now, but also better than they were the 2 or 3 years before that. Now, that's a pretty broad range. I know, I realize that. But that's the kind of scenario. So when you see $12 yellow pea bids, new crop bids, greens 11.50, I think, something like that. When you see those kind of bids, I think those are reasonable based on this type of a supply scenario. So then for exports for next year, probably see some exports to the US again, some decent ones. China will come back in for bigger supplies, but they are a big question. What if they start to buy more Russian peas, a whole bunch more Russian peas? Then even if we have lower supplies, then we're going to be scratching our heads a little bit and wondering, well, where are we going to sell them to and at what price? Because if our next best choice is Pakistan or Bangladesh or something like that, they're more price sensitive yet. So that is a big question to watch. So for this next year, there's really no cushion for adverse weather again. There's firm domestic use, and that is, again, don't get me wrong, that domestic processing is the best thing that could happen to this industry, any Canadian industry, frankly. What price does Chinese feed demand need to come back into the market? I don't know exactly where that is, but it's not at $11 and $12 new crop bids. It's lower than that. China is looking for more sources of peas, and that's clear. And so we're hoping that doesn't happen right away. And then the shifts in farmer selling behavior. So again, because there isn't a lot of new crop contracting going on, does that mean when we get to August, September, that there's going to be a whole bunch more peas dumped on the market? That caused even deeper, lows, harvest lows. That's something that is quite possible. Or if you decide I'm going to hold out for $14 or whatever, well, then maybe not so much. So that's the pea side of the picture. So lentils, this is what we had this year. Red peas. They do grow red peas in Australia, by the way. But red lentils were down 41%. Green lentils were down 53%. So a much bigger drop for green lentil production. And so again, that's why you see some of that price differential that you have. Our pea exports so far this year through the first 6 months started off great. And then, I mean, we just don't have supplies. And then there were all the container issues and all kinds of things like that. And so we dropped below 50,000 tons in January. To hit our target that we have, that we think we could, if we maxed out on terms of our exports, we need to have a fairly decent rebound. That's these gray bars here. We have to have a pretty decent rebound. Now, that there are signs that there's some improvement going on in terms of that export movement that will probably happen in April, May, and then maybe even into later in the year. There's some signs that we'll see that. We'll talk about that in a second. This is the US lentil crop. So again, yeah, their yields got hammered. 600 pounds an acre was their lentils. They grow mostly greens, mostly medium greens is what they're growing. So that side of the market was helped again by the US crop dropping off. Here's the Australian crop. So the production are these blue bars. That's how much they grow this year. So they had a record. They just released a week or two ago record it's mostly almost all red lentils. Red lentil production. These purple bars are their exports. You notice something odd? They're exporting more than they produce almost every year. And you thought StatsCan was bad at counting lentils. Like almost every year, they export more than they produce. Like I can understand 1 or 2 years if you have a bunch of carryover and so on and so on. But almost anyway. So it's possible that they actually could be growing up to 1 million tons of lentils this year, based on how badly they've underestimated production in the last few years. So some people would say to me, well, yeah, but they only export for 6 months and then they kind of disappear. Well, not when you have 1 million tons of production, you don't. So their exports have been pretty steady throughout the year. So they don't really just go away. Here's the other big issue. India is a deal for lentils. And even before we had crop problems in Canada, so that's this black line with the yellow dots, that's India this year. It was they weren't really buying all that many lentils. And again, some of it is related to transportation issues, especially with green lentils, containers particularly. But even with reds, they haven't been buying at the same pace. And so part of our expectation has always been, well, they just will keep buying no matter what, and they'll buy just bazillions of tons of lentils. This year they really haven't, and it's already was going slow even before we had crop problems. So it wasn't that Canada doesn't have them, so therefore they're not importing them. They were already kind of before that. Here's one of the more positive things for Canadian farmers, not good for Turkish farmers, because that's always the way it is, right? You benefit at somebody else's misery. So their lentil production was down pretty significantly. So they had drought in especially in the red lentil area of the country where they grow red lentils. It's a winter crop in Turkey, the red lentils. And so they had a really bad crop. And it's already looking that way, that it's already dry again for the one that's in the ground now for harvest in June, I think, June, July, somewhere around there. So it's already not looking great for that. So that's one of the optimistic signs in terms of our lentil exports. But what I have to say though is that their lentil exports tend to spike in spring. But look what they did in January. So that's what happens when your currency devaluates like whatever, and you have economic turmoil in the country, is trade almost screeches to a halt. So they were on pace. They had been really ramping up their lentil imports until December, and that's about when the whole thing went to pot. And in January, their exports dropped almost nothing. I think they're starting to sort things out, or some of that uncertainty anyway is sorting itself out. So that's one of the reasons why I think we'll see lentil imports start to pick up again, and both reds and greens, by the way, from Turkey. One of the things that we sometimes hear about is, well, yeah, but the Black Sea, the Russians, or in this case, Kazakhstan and Russia, they're they've really moved into the lentil market. Well, they did about 2 or 3 years ago. So these are their exports in 2018-19 and 19-20. And then they've kind of gone away again. This year they've kind of spiked a little bit, but now they're dropping back to some pretty low levels again. So they're not producing the volume of lentils that make them a big competitor. So in terms of the impact now, especially from Ukraine, that's the yellow lines on the chart there, yellow bars. Ukraine is almost non-existent in terms of lentil trade. So that it probably isn't as big a deal in the lentil market as it would be, let's say, in peas. So in terms of some of the red lentil prices in various markets, so this is Saskatchewan, and the red line here is Australia, Adelaide. So you see the prices starting to come down in a number of these markets. The exception would be the yellow line, which is Turkey. And again, you see what the volatility happened in lentil prices as they were going through that gong show of currency and all kinds of things. But now those prices are but generally in these markets, Canadian, Australian, in Pakistan and in India, red lentil prices have been moving lower. So, I mean, I just saw this week that, some red lentil bids, pop back up to 40 cents and, that type of thing. I'm not going to hold my breath that that's going to be a big sustained move. It might be just a fairly short-term thing because the markets tend to be trending lower in some of these key areas, with the exception of maybe Turkey. So again, in terms of seasonality, it's actually quite interesting is that especially for reds, there's a peak. It actually turns higher into that May timeframe, and a little bit to a lesser extent for greens. But again, is this year so different that the seasonals are not going to work or don't work to the same degree or those types of things? And so, I'd like to be optimistic. Maybe we're in this time frame now where we're starting to see a bit of a run up in red lentil prices, but I don't know that it's going to be significant. And the reasons I would say that would be Australian lentils. They're exporting. We did 50,000 tons in January. I think Australia exported 120,000 tons. So, there are some sizable volumes available from there. India just kind of, they're harvested their crop. It's probably close to a record as well too. And so that leaves Turkey as your main buyer. So I don't know if Turkey can support the red lentil market to that degree. And just saw that Turkey has just prohibited re-exports of a number of crops, including lentils. So they're a pretty big trade hub. So they've prohibited re-exports. I could go on another rant, but anyway, I won't. Okay, so I thought I had some slides about India. So India, this was their rainfall during the Rabi season, so the winter season. It starts, well, this map starts beginning of October, but it's kind of usually middle of or early November until now. There haven't been any real problems in India. Worst case are these white areas where it's kind of normal rainfall. It is their dry season, but a whole lot of areas, and this area here, and then going up into the northeast, that's where they tend to grow lentils and peas. And so some pretty good conditions there. So what they're talking about is close to a record crop. And again, it's almost all red lentils grown in India. So acreage was up and in good conditions. So I wouldn't suspect that India is going to be coming in for big volumes of red lentils, maybe greens, maybe more greens. And we've seen some green lentil bids in the last couple of weeks, up 3-4 cents a pound. So some pretty good red lentil or green lentil bids just in the last few weeks. So that's what I'm looking at, guesstimating in terms of lentil acreage this year is a pretty small increase, about 3% increase. And because of the spreads that you have now between greens and reds, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of like a movement from reds into greens or the other way around or things like that. I think it's a pretty well balanced kind of a price scenario that'll keep that mix roughly steady. And again, using a cautious yield estimate, I think in this case, we used the 5-year average, which now includes this yield, and then we shaved another 5% off of that. Again, just in recognition of the risk that we have going into this year. So what that means in terms of supplies, so again, a few more acres, but with this cautious yield, we're going to have a partial recovery in lentil supplies, and more so for reds, but again, not back to the years we had 5 years, over the 5 years prior to the drought. So again, it's that same type of a situation. And this kind of model or thinking really applies to a whole bunch of crops, not just pulses. And then greens would stay actually, would recover even less. And so we'd have some fairly tight supplies of green lentils going into next year. Oops, I got the years wrong on the bottom, but this is, so in terms of the market factors, again, very low ending stocks at the end of this year, but demand hasn't been, like there hasn't been this frantic buying, this frantic buying, stop touching that thing, this frantic buying of lentils. And so the expectations that we had at the beginning when we saw those crops, just awful looking crops, and we thought, okay, you know, we're going to be 70, 80 cent large greens and 50, 60 cent, you know, reds and things like that. The demand just hasn't been desperate enough or panicky enough, urgent enough to push at that. So India especially has been just kind of so-so. Maybe we'll see, I think we'll see a little bit more yet from Turkey in the last few months of this year. And again, I think that provides some of these pops in bids that we're getting. The acreage and production response, again, probably a small increase, but there's limits on how much that'll increase, and in yields, you know, don't really know. And just like in peas, there's this reluctance to forward contract. So is that going to push more on to the market right at harvest time? Something to think about. And again, no cushion for another bad weather year. So, you know, if we go into this spring and it turns into a 2021 again, or something almost as bad, you know, all of these price project or all of these ideas kind of go out the window again. So, you know, keep that in mind as well too. So I think that's everything that I had. So thank you again. Thanks for the invitation to come out here. I just so much appreciate it. Should I ask if there's questions now? Sorry, Trent, so you don't have to get up. Is there anything online, Amanda?
Yeah, actually, we got a question earlier today, but it's much more market related, so it was punted to you. So this person wanted to know which type of chickpea has more demand for both domestic and international products, Desi or Kabuli? Or sorry, I said products, markets. Is it Desi or Kabuli?
The much larger market is Desi. The more accessible market and the more traded market is Kabuli. So when I say that, India is growing or planted 25 million acres of chickpeas this year. Most of those, almost all of those are Desis. So in terms of the size, total size of the production and all of that kind of stuff, Desis are the big market, and Pakistan is another large buyer. Kabulis are much more freely traded. So you have countries like Argentina, Mexico, India is an exporter, Russia is an exporter. They'll export the real small ones, 6-7 millimeter types that almost work into those Desi applications. But it's a much more traded thing. So I don't know quite how to answer that question, but for the Canadian market right now has struggled to market into the Desi environment. And we've had more success. And largely, again, this is another one of these things where our largest customer this year has been the US, and it's been for milling. And they do want Kabulis, so things for pet food and for human food. So they've been our largest buyer and our most aggressive buyer. Otherwise, we're competing into Pakistan. They're our second largest customer, and they're quite price sensitive because they have access to 6-7 millimeter Russian chickpeas and so on. So that's probably, not quite answering the question the way the person asked, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Probably a complicated question, but given the price of oil and how that influences the price of fertilizer and ag chemicals, will that, and it's where we have no foreseen future as to what's going to happen to mitigate that issue, will that offer any price support to the commodity prices for pulses in the future?
That is it's a big question. The fertilizer issue, yeah, you're absolutely right. There isn't a projected end to when that's going to resolve itself or things like that. And nitrogen is of course the big one. And at a very small level, it's very individual. My brother bought all of his fertilizer September, so he's happy. Some guys have, some guys haven't. So it's a very individual type of a situation. In terms of impact on pulse prices, what I would say is that it would, I'm not sure that I would be having as many peas in the ground on my forecast or lentils in the ground on my forecast if nitrogen prices were kind of average. So part of that has already been built into those. And so in that way, it actually isn't supportive for pulse prices. It might do the opposite. I don't know though, in my talking to people and my, just observing and things like that, with pulses in particular, it feels like, and Carl's going to hate me for saying this, but it feels like we're kind of hitting against the ceiling in terms of agronomics and what we can produce in the ground. So we're not going to have pulses, take over Western Canada just because agronomically, at least not yet, until all this other research does its magic, we're not going to have pulse prices, or pulse acres really dominate. So it's going to be a bit of a muted effect, I would say, in terms of pulse markets. I think from a broader perspective, and not even from a Canadian perspective, the sky high energy prices and fertility prices are going to be positive for broader markets, crop markets. Because you think about Ukraine, even if they get their crop in the ground, are they going to get fertilizer on it? Are they going to, and a whole bunch of European countries, even though it's winter crops, are they going to be able to top dress when they want to, or when they need to? All of those kind of issues are going to kind of weigh on yields generally. And so that's, again, from somebody else's misery, you might see the benefit from that.
We have another question from our online audience. Chuck, what do you see for acreage shifts in Western Canada?
Oh, geez, I knew I should have brought that along. In terms of acreage shifts, not huge ones. And again, we just did this week. We just we're sending out our reports this week to talk about our 2022 acreage things. You think I would remember them, right? Sent them out this morning. Anyway, one of the things that I've learned is that if you just look at acreage shifts in terms of prices, you can't. It's easy to overestimate when you just look at prices, and there's so much that's locked in on crop rotations and so on. So that's the disclaimer at the beginning. We have changed. Some people have been talking, some other people have been talking about canola acres actually going down this year. We have it going up, I think, about 2 or 3%. Earlier, we were looking at spring wheat, red spring wheat acres actually being down this year. And now we're, again, looking at a pretty small increase in spring wheat. Some of that would have got taken out of Durham. well, the peas, you know, up 1 or 2%, lentils up 3%. So again, not huge swings. In terms of the special crops, barley acres being down, oat acres up, but I don't remember exactly how much. I think maybe 7%. So a bit of an increase. And I think oats is one of those ones that will increase acres because of energy costs and because of fertility costs and things like that. Some of the smaller ones, I still think we'll see quite a bit more mustard, depending on seed supplies. I've had people tell me I'm out to lunch. Not just about that, but about that too. Canary seed up. I'm just trying to think. Any other crops that what am I missing? Flax. Flax up a few percent, but $25 flax. People still hate the straw. Dealing with the straw. So I think we've got flax acres at 1.1 million, which I think is up 7 or 8%, something like that from last year. Sunflowers up because they really did well last year in the drought and great prices. There's one of the ones that the Ukrainian situation, sorry, I'll back up. The Ukraine produced about 17 million tons of sunflowers last year. They're the world's largest producer of sunflowers. That's increased our sunflower bids, but that's also been behind the increases in canola prices, soybean prices, palm oil prices, a whole bunch. When you take 40% oil out of the picture, suddenly you've taken 7-8 million tons of vegetable oils, high quality vegetable oils, out of the global supply situation. So that's been actually Ukrainian sunflowers. You know, again, you don't see that in the headlines all that much, but it's a big one, and it's affecting. It's that rising tide that lifts a whole bunch of oilseed boats. Oh, here comes Jared. I like Jared.
I'm good for questions.
If anybody wants to bug him, he's wearing a Lululemon shirt, by the way.
That's it. That's it. Chuck, I wonder if you could talk about biofuels and just sort of anything you may have read on that. And there's different talk about reducing mandates and anything you might have for quick thoughts. Thanks.
Well, there's a whole, I mean, that's a whole nother topic, but I'll try a few comments on it anyway. I mean, one of the things that you see with all of these announcements about canola crush plants, in almost all of them at Regina, go figure, you know, all of that is, or a large chunk of that is built around this premise of the clean fuel standard that has been proposed by our illustrious government in Ottawa. And so that's been very positive, but it is always a little frightening, a little vulnerable when an industry is built on government deciding something, or government meddling, or government whatever you want to call it. Sorry, I'm not the most diplomatic when it comes to those kind of things. So on one hand, from a Canadian perspective, that appears fairly positive. It's a different situation when it comes to ethanol in the States related to corn, because there's getting to be even more pushback there now that, you know, it's not environmentally positive, and I don't know all of the terms, the buzzwords, but it doesn't have all of those same environmental benefits and so on. And you have crude oil at, I don't know what it is the last time I checked, it's $125 a barrel. You have all of those kind of things, you know, arguing against it. I think what's going to happen in the short term, I can't predict what Joe Biden is going to do, partly because he's senile, but he's also, I don't think he's ready to take that on. I think what's going to happen in the short term is that these extremely high energy prices just cause people to drive less, and so and conserve in a whole bunch of different ways, and so that's going to just lower the whole demand for not only for petroleum but also for biofuels, and so you're going to see that. I mean, I was fascinated when we were driving up from Winnipeg, how many semi units. Like the ones pulling just one trailer, like they were in the minority. Almost all of them were pulling 2 trailers. And I don't think I've ever noticed that big of a shift before. Maybe I haven't paid attention before. But there's all kinds of things that where we're going to lower total consumption. And I think that will have, that is going to happen regardless of any government decisions, anything like that. And so, but yeah, there are the positive things. If bio or renewable diesel and biodiesel both are in demand from Canadian canola, again, as I said, any domestic processing that we have is your strongest demand. They don't back off when prices go high. They just keep buying. If I'd show you a canola chart, what happened to canola use this last year, exports went like that. Domestic crush went like that. And so it's all, that is from a very positive kind of an aspect. So I don't know if I answered your question properly, but, and I gave you my political leanings too. Okay.
Thanks, Chuck, for the informative market report.